Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Three Stooges, where we explore fascinating moments in history. We're your hosts, Glennis, Katherine, and Tyra, and today we'll be diving into the story of end of World War II and the consequences with Italy, Germany, and Japan. Catherine is going to tell us what we're going to do today.
What led to the end of war and how did it impact the world as we know it? Let's find out.
The consequences of World War II are that the world became divided into an Eastern Bloc led by the Soviet Union and a Western Bloc led by the United States. Internationally, alliances with two blocs gradually shifted, with some nations trying to stay out of the Cold War through non-aligned movement. The 1940s were defined by World War II, the disaster, atomic bombs, and the beginning of Cold War. At this time, women were needed to replace injured men that went to war. Also, wartime production pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression. Diplomatic agreements made near the conclusion of World War II reshaped international relations. How might these agreements reflect the motivations of ideologies of the nations involved?
The US and British generally agreed that the future government of Eastern Europe nations bordering in Soviet Union should be friendly to the Soviet. The Soviet pledged to free elections for the territories and release them from Nazi Germany. However, this did not actually happen, and in effect of these Europe countries were conquered by the Soviets.
At Yalta, the big three of the United States, Great Britain, and Soviet Union agreed that after Germany's unconditional surrender, it would be divided into 4 post-war job zones controlled by US, British, French, and Soviet military forces. The city of Berlin would also be divided into similar job zones. The Yalta's conference's intention also involved the Soviet Union participation in the United Nations and included a commitment from Stalin to join the war with Japan. In dissimilary, the Potsdam conferences by Truman following Roosevelt's death pushed a tougher stance against the Soviets' actions, essentially conquering and repressing Eastern Europe, much as the Germans had.
The outcome of the Tehran Conference was the Western Allies' commitment to open a second front against Nazi Germany, including an invasion of France. Although the leaders arrived with differing objectives, the Tehran Conference was the first World War II conference of the Big Three Allied leaders. So tell me, Tyra, in what ways did post-war treaties contribute to the economic recovery of each nation?
Following their unconditional surrender to the Allies, Japanese economic growth after 1940s was based on expansions of industrial production and the development of a big domestic market, as well as a hostile export trade policy. Italy faced serious post-war economic problems. Wartime's government had printed money to pay for arms, and nation escalated.
The two main factors that Germany recovered from were currency reform and the elimination of price controls, both of which happened over a period of weeks in 1948. A further factor was the reduction of marginal tax rates later in 1948 and 1949, calling off the passive resistance of German workers in the close rear, the main industrial area of Germany. This helped Germany's economy because goods were back in production and the government could stop printing money to pay striking workers. After the Potsdam Conference, Germany was divided into 4 occupied zones: Great Britain in the northwest, France in the southwest, the United States in the south, and the Soviet Union in the east. Berlin, the capital city situated in Soviet territory, was also divided into 4 occupied zones. The Potsdam Conference was held at Potsdam in the Soviet occupation zone from July 17 to August 2, 1945, to allow the 3 leading allies to plan the post-war peace while avoiding the mistakes of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. The participants were the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States.
They were represented respectively by General Secretary Joseph Stalin, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Clement Attlee, and President Harry S. Truman. They gathered to decide how to administer Germany, which had agreed to unconditional surrender 9 weeks earlier. The goal of the conference was included establishing the post-war order, solving issues on the peace treaty, and countering the effects of the war. The situation for civilians in Germany after World War II was really bad. Lots of Germans were homeless from the enemy's bombing campaigns that damaged a lot of cities, and more Germans living in Poland and East Prussia became refugees when the Soviet Union expelled them.
After World War II, the victors decided to rebuild Germany rather than to punish. It intended to keep the same thing from happening again. They also wanted to prevent the defeated nations from turning to communism. Also, they wanted these nations to become economic allies with the U.S. In order to do this, a plan called a Marshall Plan was devised.
The Marshall Plan was a U.S.-sponsored program designed to rehabilitate the economies of 17 Western and Southern European countries in order to create stable conditions in which democratic institutions could survive in the aftermath of World War II. It was formerly called the European Recovery Program.
Driven by growing consumer demand as well as the continuing expansion of the military-industrial complex as the Cold War ramped up, the United States reached new heights of prosperity in the years after World War II. The Allies punished Japan for its militarism and expansion by covering up crimes trials in Tokyo. At the same time, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers pulled apart the Japanese army and banned former military officers from taking roles of political leadership in the new government. One of Japan's main goals during World War II was to remove the United States as a Pacific power in order to gain territory in East Asia and the Southwest Pacific Islands. During the war, more than 1 million Japan children were evacuated from cities to the relative safety of the countryside, splitting up families in the process. By the end of World War, Japan's cities were destroyed, their stockpiles exhausted, and their industrial capacity gutted. Tokyo and other Japanese cities suffered extraordinary destruction by established bombing.
You may be wondering, how did the political changes in these countries after World War II set the stage for their future governance and industrial relations?
By spending money in the reconstruction of countries damaged by World War II, the Americans created new markets to give America goods. In the post-war era, the United States adopted a strategy of foreign policy that has come to be known as containment. Basically, the policy of containment was designed to contain the spread of communism, but not really fight it where it was already present. To help pay for the war, the government increased corporate and personal income taxes. The federal income tax entered the lives of many Americans. In 1938, less than 8 million people filed individual income tax returns. In 1945, almost 50 million people filed. After winning World War II, the U.S. became a world power. Because the United States became and remained a world power in the 20th century, it is known as the American century. Today, the U.S. is the strongest country in the world.
The outcome of the end of the war had a lasting impact on Germany, Italy, and Japan. Shortages of food, fuel, and all kinds of consumer products persisted and in many cases worsened after peace was declared, which the representatives from 21 countries met in Paris from July to October 1946 to negotiate the terms of the treaties. Signed in the French capital on February 10, 1947, the treaties formally ended the war in Europe and established a new peaceful order on the continent. Truman announced Japan's surrender at the end of the World War II.
What happened to Italy after World War II was bad. Italy went through the destruction of industries and agriculture. The rate of unemployment went up and the country's currency collapsed. The cost of living increased by 20 times and the cost of goods doubled compared to 1938. So to recap the end of war, the consequence was a turning point because the effects of war include long-term physical and psychological harm to children and adults, as well as reduction in material and human capital. Also, the ongoing political rivalry between the United United States and Soviet Union and their respective allies that developed after World War II.
What do you think would have happened if the war had ended differently? World War II had to be the last war because Europe could not have another. Also, members of the United Nations agreed to outlaw wars of aggression in an attempt to avoid a third world war.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the Three Stooges. For more deep dives into history, feel free to share your thoughts with us on YouTube.
And that's it. Thanks for listening. The Three Stooges are signing off.